As every soul alive today knows, humankind has been locked in a death spiral known as the Succession Wars since the final collapse of the Star League. The first of these began almost immediately after Alexander Kerensky's exodus over 240 years ago, and there has been less than a decade of quiet since. Even dividing this period into separate conflicts remains a contentious issue among historians, as in many cases low-level fighting continued and a peace agreement was never reached. In its day, what we now call the First was simply known as the Great Succession War, and the idea that the chain of conflicts would continue for another 2 centuries was inconceivable. The era of the Star League was bookended by 2 of the most devastating calamities humanity had ever known: the Reunification War and the Star League Civil War. Each directly resulted in over 100 million deaths in less than 2 decades. Despite its fabled reputation as a time of unity, by the latter years of the Star League, the Inner Sphere was poised for self-destruction. Kerensky's defense force was the only thing keeping the proverbial foot on the brake. But with their departure, there was nothing left to keep the great houses in check. The cataclysm that followed would lead to more wartime casualties than humanity's 100 millennia of history combined. By the end of 2784, this outcome had become an inevitability. Throughout the era of the Star League, each individual nation had been carefully kept in check, but with the shocking exodus of the peacekeeping SLDF, those left behind suddenly found themselves on equal footing. The seat of power was vacant, and supremacy overall was attainable. The ruling Cameron line had been exterminated during the Amaris coup, as had the usurper Amaris' offspring, and perhaps the only realistic candidate to replace them had left on a self-imposed exile. The surviving associate members had won their freedom during the brutal Periphery uprising, the long-suffering territorial states having little interest in continued involvement in the League. This left the 5 council lords of the other member states, none with the authority to claim the position of First Lord outright, but all covetous of the power that came with it. If they wanted to press their claim, they would have to do so through force of arms. Humanity's slow slide back into feudalism was at its high watermark around this point. The fate of trillions within the Inner Sphere were now controlled by just a handful of ruling dynasties. The 5 heads of state that had disbanded the High Council in 2781, more through fear that their rivals would use it to seize power than a willingness to give it up themselves, were First Prince John Davion of the Federated Sons, Coordinator Minoru Kurita of the Draconis Combine, Captain General Kenyon Marik of the Free Worlds League, Chancellor Barbara Liao of the Capellan Confederation, and Archon Robert Steiner II of the Lyran Commonwealth. Upon the latter's return to his capital of Tharkad, he immediately fell ill and died shortly afterwards, the prevailing rumour at the time being that it was divine retribution for his involvement in the breakup of the Star League. His daughter Jennifer took up the Archonship in his stead. These 5 would in time come to be known as the Successor Lords, a title that is still jealously clung to by their descendants to this day. The First Succession War was a true free-for-all with no meaningful alliances to speak of, nor was there a single event that kicked off the fighting on all fronts simultaneously. As such, natives of each realm often date the conflict based on their own individual histories. However, more often than not, the engagements that took place in the years between Kerensky's departure and the point at which each head of state declared their first lordship are segregated into a period known as the Phoney War, and it began within the ruins of the Terran hegemony. The nation that had grown up around humanity's birthplace was at one time the mightiest of all the interstellar states. Now, it was an irradiated wasteland. The SLDF had done their best to manage the humanitarian crisis as they advanced towards Terra, but many planets were still barely surviving at a subsistence level, while others were completely abandoned. Racing to their aid were the noble Great Houses, flooding the outer worlds with relief efforts, and thereby clandestinely positioning themselves to claim ownership of those systems in the coming years. Some of the threatened planets attempted to band together into new realms, as had happened following the breakup of the Terran Alliance centuries earlier. The core worlds were in the worst state, still protected by the remnants of the Starly Defense Force, unofficially helmed by Jerome Blake. His branch of government, the Department of Communications, was the last vestige of the once colossal Bureau of Starleague Affairs. His efforts made him the face of the recovery, without whom countless millions would have starved. Indeed, among some citizens, he was an almost saintly figure. Throughout the previous 2 years, the soon-to-be successor states had been claiming worlds along their borders, gradually closing in around Terra. One of the most rapacious was the Free Worlds League. The Captain General had faced a crisis when the League fell, as that institution was what had assured the Marik family continued dynasty over their realm. With war in the offing, he was able to convince his government to agree to Resolution 288 on December 19, 2784, which would grant him supreme authority for the duration of the crisis, forestalling any talk of a reduction in Marik power. The seized hegemony worlds were touted as bountiful prizes, made possible only through his actions, their sorry condition kept hidden from the public by his intelligence agency, SAFE. The voracious appetite of the other ruling lords led them to continue to absorb planets into their empires wherever they could, but before they came into conflict with Blake and his SLDF forces, they ran into each other. Town was one of the former hegemony worlds seized by the Federated Sons in 2783, and would be one of the ignition points of the Phoney War. The occupation force on Town came from 2 regions of Davion space. The Hussars redeployed from Collier in the Fairfax combat region, while the Interceptors transferred across from Ulaanbaatar in the Chesterton ZR. Their place of origin seemed an insignificant fact to the Federated Sons High Command, but they were about to discover how dysfunctional their military had become. Spending cuts on transportation, coupled with a lack of action over the past few decades, have resulted in the armed forces of the Federated Sons becoming increasingly provincial, with stronger ties to their home planet than their compatriots elsewhere in the AWFS. When the 2 deployed to Town, they took up responsibility for one hemisphere each, and had little to no communication or combat drills together. A military coincidence soon brought their lack of cooperation into sharp focus. Arriving in system near simultaneously in February 2785, were a battalion-sized raiding force each from the Capellan Confederation Armed Forces and the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery. Neither was working with the other, and both had their own individual targets. Majors Wilkins and Donner argued about how to respond to the incoming raiders, their inability to reach a consensus allowing the hostile forces time to make landfall on opposite ends of Town virtually unopposed. They swept across the planet, ransacking what military equipment they could reach, while causing widespread destruction and loss of life. 4,000 died in the 2 weeks it took for the Hussars and Interceptors to come together and force the Capellan and Combine forces to withdraw. In the aftermath of the debacle, the First Prince passed the Town Charter, which gave the militia free rein to take what they needed from the AWFS warehouses, though this was of little comfort to the dead. Elsewhere in the Terran hegemony, the successor states continued to gobble up undefended worlds. The same was true for several jointly administered planets along the borders between other states. The Capellan seizure of Valexa the previous year had caused considerable concern among the field marshals of the Federated Sons, as they had fought a brief border war with the Confederation just 2 decades earlier. When they took Andro in 2785, Chief of MI2 Dana Bancroft advised the First Prince that the Capellans were about to launch a campaign against him, a warning that he took to heart. Across the Inner Sphere, the Lyran Commonwealth had the same concerns about the Free Worlds League's efforts to take full control of jointly administered worlds along their border, and they were right to think so. Kenyan Marik had been moving supplies to the Bolan Thumb in preparation of a major assault for some years now, but Kerensky's exodus had diverted his attention, along with the additional regiments meant to take up positions within the region, to the softer, juicier targets of the Terran hegemony. Steiner had long chafed at the existence of the Bolan salient jutting into their territory. With Kerensky no longer on the map, Lyran High Command began making preparations for what would be known as Operation Elbow Joint. General of the armies Paul Steiner was the mastermind behind the Bolan offensive, with command of the task force given to Lieutenant General Baron Richard Johansson von Eilenberg, a veteran of Operation Almanac. Participating in the attack would be 3 mech and 6 conventional regiments, as well as 7 of the Navy's warships, a trio of Commonwealth-class cruisers, and a quartet of Mako-class corvettes. The defense of the world was orchestrated from within the old SLDF base known as the Overwatch. Notionally in charge of the 2 mech regiments, 3 League-class destroyers and single Aegis-class cruiser deployed to Bolin was Colonel Salam Tut. The operation began on March 7th when the merchant transport Lucian Bell arrived at the system's zenith. 2 squadrons of aerospace fighters exited the vessel and swiftly destroyed every non-Lyran craft at the jump point, while a dropship ferried Marines across to take control of the customs station. The LCS Furilo now appeared, transporting the Sky Rangers invasion troops. The station's occupants desperately tried to contact Bolin, but their message would take hours to arrive yet. Long before then, the remaining 6 warships and 8 regiments of the LCAF arrived at a pirate point, in position to intercept the planet's solar orbit. The space battle began poorly for the overeager Commonwealth Navy. Their corvettes raced ahead to engage the heavier League destroyers. Tiberium took the worst pounding, but was able at least to force the Nerva to withdraw. The ship was failing though, and in an act of desperation, plotted a collision course with the inbound Donegal. The Lyran crew was able to evade the ramming attack, and devastated the Tiberium with a broadside in the process, sending the League vessel tumbling into orbit. Meanwhile, the other 2 cruisers engaged each other with withering fire. Caledonia suffered heavy damage, but outperformed the much older Manaslu, which was blown apart by a pair of nuclear-armed missiles. The remaining League-class destroyers continued to fight for a time, bringing down a pair of Makos, but had to withdraw as the Furilo approached from the jump point. The Lyrans achieved naval supremacy by the 13th. The LCAF began landing the next day. Orbital guns located within the Overwatch made approaching the Sabari island chain all but impossible. This focused the action on the 2 continents of Kashmir and SUCKit, and the 4 major cities on World. The Arcturan Guards made landfall at Peshawar, quickly eliminating all resistance in the area. While their aerospace fighters swept the surrounding townships for targets, Johansson threatened an imminent attack on Calcutta. Instead, the attack came 2 days later at Quetta, on the opposite side of the planet. Furilo arrived overhead to bombard the spaceport, while the Sky Rangers descended to lay siege to the city below. Meanwhile, the 11th Arcturan Guards were boosted across world to assault the capital city of Mumbai. A day-long bombardment left both cities in ruins. On March 18th, the Lyran's massed aerospace assets conducted a brutal firebombing campaign at Calcutta, obliterating all resistance within and claiming the lives of some 20,000 civilians. That number is only an estimate, as what happened next makes the true figure unknowable. Colonel Tut ordered all units to rush the Lyran positions and pin them in place, while he began launch procedures. As the fighting grew fierce, the first nuclear weapons began descending on the 4 major cities of Bolin, annihilating both Freeworlders and Lyrans alike. The Lieutenant General quickly raced his naval assets towards the Overwatch and unleashed his full arsenal on the base below to stop the launches. The Bolin defenders had enough dropships on hand to lift just 1 of their battalions off-world, their remaining destroyers in orbit perishing in a rearguard action. The Lyran Commonwealth had achieved its first victory of the Succession Wars, but it had come at a heavy cost. Around 45% of their invasion force had been destroyed, and Bolin itself had been devastated. In the aftermath of Operation Elbow Joint, Kenyan Marik officially declared a state of war between the Free Worlds League and Lyran Commonwealth. He also stated that the conduct of the fighting on Bolin made it clear that neither side had any intention of sticking to the mythical and long-defunct Ares conventions. Henceforth, the FWLM had free rein to use their full strategic arsenal. He may have regretted that decision later that year, when a pair of Commonwealth-class cruisers arrived at the recently seized hegemony planet Denebola. Colonel DeWitt felt little compunction about ordering orbital strikes to devastate the forces sheltering in the old SLDF base below. Likewise, they quickly dispatched the pair of Vincent-class corvettes in orbit, clearing the path for their own ground troops to make landfall and claim Denebola as their own. On the Commonwealth Spinwood border, the Draconis Combine was looking to make its own gains. They had illicitly hired 20 bandit groups to keep their neighbours off balance, while they prepared their offensive. Minoru Kurita was planning an all-out assault on one of his two rival Successor Lords as a mean to demonstrate his own strength, and through it, Kurita's right to rule the Star League, though it was becoming increasingly unclear as to whether such a thing even existed anymore. He would make his decision based on a series of probing attacks, the first of which targeted House Steiner. In August 2785, Bone Norman was raided by a battalion of unmarked mechs, whose primary concern seemed to be causing as much damage as possible. Subsequent attacks by aerospace fighters in the Barcelona and Somerset systems raised the spectre of a resurgent Rimwell's Republic among Lyran High Command. Some speculated that the attacks, which had in truth been carried out by the Combine's Azami people, were Kuritan false flag operations, but Paul Steiner concluded that both aggressors would be just as likely to exploit a weakness along the periphery. As such, several regiments were redeployed to the Corwood border. The DCMS now struck, targeting the planets Gram and Trolloc Prime, overwhelming the planetary militia by December 2785. In the case of the latter, some 3,000 civilians caught in the crossfire found refuge within the local HPG station, an act of magnanimity that earned Blake's followers further acclaim. That same month, the Dieron regulars were making another assault on the planet Town, only this time their goal was to capture the planet. Their earlier raid had clued them in to how disorganized the planetary garrison was, and the mechs and 7 supporting infantry and aerospace regiments made short work of them. Reinforcements only arrived in February, by which time it was too late. On Terra, Jerome Blake was busy reinforcing his own tenuous position. The rest of the Inner Sphere was closing in on all sides, and it wouldn't be long before they reached humanity's homeworld. In December 2785, one of Blake's close friends from the latter days of the Civil War, Conrad Toyama, became the chief administrator for the SLComnet Prime Circuit station on Dieron. The network had come back online just 3 days after Kerensky's exodus. There was little doubt that he would not be returning, and so in the months that followed, the decision was made to rename the unwieldy and misrepresentative Star League Department of Communications. At Toyama's urging, January 2786 saw the launch of the newly rebranded ComStar. The organisation began by introducing the ComStar Letter of Credit, later inheriting the colloquial name C-Bill from the old Star League dollar. The recovery efforts also continued, with one of the largest projects being the ComStar Space Debris Command, which was tasked with clearing the wreckage of many hundreds of warships and jumpships scattered throughout the hegemony. Officially, these hulks were all scrapped, but Blake concealed the existence of a rare few serviceable vessels. Curiously, no effort was made to reconstruct the orbital mirror over Venus, destroyed in a foolhardy maneuver by Amaris's goons. Over the next 2 centuries, the atmosphere slowly reverted back to its inhospitable state, with barely a few thousand left today inhabiting the former home of 200 million. Elsewhere in the Terran hegemony, several systems were taking matters of defense into their own hands. They could see the old state collapsing, but wished to retain their independence from the larger nations around them. A fledgling alliance was formed in the Lone Star province, key among which were the systems of Dieron and Inglesmond, containing the Stella Trek and LTV aerospace warship facilities. The unification of these planets under Inglesmond came just in time to resist House Kurita's next thrust deep into the Lone Star province. The DCMS entered the region in early 2786, their objective to settle an old score dating back almost 500 years to before the Combine's founding, when Dieron split from the rest of the Alliance of Galadin, in protest of Shiro Kurita's double-dealing. The former hegemony worlds gave the Kuritans unexpected difficulties, however. The industrial output of these planets allowed them to field advanced battle mechs that at one time would have been exclusive to the SLDF Royal regiments. Furthermore, they had at least 2 warships of their own, with several more under construction. In March, the First Prince and his field marshals concluded that they would soon be at war with the Capellan state, and decided that a preemptive strike was preferable. They were still monitoring what appeared to be significant DCMS activity within the Galadin district on their Corwood flank, but the Department of Military Intelligence suggested that the Kuritans were more afraid of Kerensky returning than preparing to attack. Large chunks of the Davion armed forces relocated to the Liao border around the Chesterton worlds. That same month, Kenyan Marik set about evening the score for Bolan and Denabola, beginning with an attack against Altoona. Nuclear weapons were used to eradicate the surviving battalion of Sky Rangers from Operation Elbow Joint. He followed that up with the takeover of the undefended Hornieres Keep in July. It seemed to the rest of the Inner Sphere that Minoru Kurita had decided which of his immediate foes would become the focus of their own upcoming campaign. In June, the Lyran defences at Skondia were caught completely unawares when a merchant vessel appeared in system and undocked with a sextet of dropships. They burned hard for the planet, whereupon half of them made landfall outside the major northern cities. The LCAF moved to protect the high-priority factories, but the attacking Kuritans had a different target in mind. They began instead to open fire on the civilian structures, intent on causing as much death and destruction as possible. The Arcturan guards naturally rushed to their aid, but this left the factories undefended. The second half of the Benjamin regulars now touched down at their actual objectives and raided the facilities, while the faster distraction force outpaced the heavier but slower Lyran machines to make it off-world with a minimum of casualties. The same could not be said for the Skondians, 20,000 of whom had been killed. By the midpoint of 2786, all of the border worlds formerly administered by the Star League had been taken over by one nation or another. Some of the Terran administrators were ushered out at gunpoint, others were wooed to lend their services to new masters. Remnants of the SLDF were either hired on or chased out, such as McKinnon's company on Kesai 4, who signed up with the Crucis Lancers after the Draconis Combine tried to eradicate them. The hegemony itself had continued to shrink. 2 of the former provincial capitals were now under foreign occupation. Jerome Blake could see that the so-called Phoney War was about to descend into something much worse. If he had any hope of protecting the core worlds, he would have to act fast. He outlined his plan to the ComStar First Circuit, the HPG administrators for each of the Prime Circuit stations. Preparations began for Operation Silver Shield. Trusted mercenary groups formed from ex-SLDF soldiers began relocating to Earth, while Blake himself departed to meet each of the Successor Lords. He sought recognition of ComStar's neutral status and assurances that the HPGs would not be targeted during any upcoming conflict. In a rimward direction, the Capellan Confederation moved to shore up their borders by sending the Zion Lancers to secure their homeworld after it had been taken by opportunistic Marik forces. They also cleared a path to the planet Northwind, home of the famous Northwind Highlanders, longtime mercenary auxiliaries for the Capellans. The Federated Sons likewise moved to take the home system of their Deneb-like cavalry. In December, the DCMS finally achieved their goal of reclaiming Dieron after its secession 475 years earlier. With the system under Draconis Combine rule, the Dieron regulars had at last secured a home for themselves, and a new military district was established. With this victory, Coordinator Minoru Kurita felt bold enough to make the announcement that each of the successor states were considering. He proclaimed himself First Lord of the Star League, and declared war on any who would challenge him. The Succession Wars had begun. Well guys, it's time to get this show on the road. This was the first of 15 episodes I have planned for the first Succession War. This first one was a bit of a prologue for what's to come next. Next weekend we're going to be going into detail, laying the groundwork for the coming apocalypse. There'll be a pair of episodes coming out, the first looking at the political situation, who the major players are throughout this conflict, and the second one will be a deep dive into the nitty-gritty of their militaries. This is the largest conflict that there ever is in BattleTech, so it's worth taking the time now to lay those foundations for what's going to come next. For many of you, that might just be a recap of what you're already familiar with, but by covering it all now in one place, it'll allow us to skip over that in the future installments such as the second and third Succession Wars. After that, we're going to be going on a year-by-year basis for the first 3 or 4 years of the conflict, and then after things start winding down a little bit, we'll cover a larger span of time in the same 20-30 minute time span. That's my target for this series. It's not going to be quite as long as the Star League Civil War was, probably about half the length, a little over 4 hours I think it's going to come to at the moment, but we will see. If by some chance this is the first episode of mine you're watching, you may be interested to hear that there is another 14.5 hours of content that's come before it, leading up to this point, and much more to come afterwards. Like I said, I'll be back next weekend for the next installment, but if you cannot wait and you wish to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon, where I have the next 4 episodes up available now. They're only in 1080p, so if you do want to wait for 4K or you just prefer watching through YouTube, you can join us over the next couple of weekends as we catch back up. If you've enjoyed this video, then it really does help if you share it around with other people who you think might also get a kick out of it. If you really liked it, leave me a like, leave me a comment. I always read every single one, trying to respond to as many as I can. And if you want to see more, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and join me again soon on another video.